watching Rogers TV.
Join me over coffee as we delve into topics that affect our everyday lives. And I'm in conversation today with Marilyn Struthers from the Institute of South Georgian Bay. And today we're going to be talking about the book Aging in Place, Exploring Options in Graham Bruce. Now this book was a compilation of 29 stories of people, personal experience stories of people who are aging in place. And it was Joan Beecroft who put all of this together. And on screen you will see that we have the book Aging in Place and the other things that used to matter. And Joan has done a series of books. Please check them out. But this one in particular, I invited Marilyn because she wrote the foreword to Aging in Place and has summarized many of the themes that were weaving through all the various personal stories. It's absolutely fascinating. You need to read this book. And welcome, Marilyn, and thank you for taking the time. Now, tell us about what inspired you to put the spin on the foreword that you did.
Good question. Well, Joan approached me to do the foreword because as a volunteer with the Institute, I've been doing quite a lot of work around affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And doing that largely because my kids are in rental housing, my grandkids, my great-grandson. So it sort of brings home the difficulty of the housing crisis in Canada now, right here. But I hadn't really spent much time as an older person in the community thinking about how growing older intersects with the housing crisis. So when Joan asked me to do it, I had to have a think about whether I knew anything very much about aging in place yet, quite. But it was a wonderful opportunity for me to think about the systems and the intersection of systems in our community.
Well, what I experienced in reading this book, and I've read it more than once, is the range of emotions that come out when people are having experiences and living this, sometimes challenging, sometimes difficult, sometimes being very happy in the spot that they're in. But the theme that you went through, and when you came after you read the stories, you put it in the form of a patchwork quilt. I love that analogy. So in that sense, it gives, the themes become complicated, and they also become, for me, they become personal. I am in a place in my life right now where this book is very important for me to read and to understand and to reflect on. So let's talk about some of the themes that were woven through.
Sure. Can I talk just for a sec first about the patchwork quilt analogy, which actually wasn't given to me, and Joan has picked it up and put it on the cover, which I really enjoyed, and I know she did too. Joan is a quilter, not everyone perhaps would know that. But often when you read a collection of stories, they feel like different, well, they are different people's experiences. And the interesting thing about the work that Joan's doing around story collection is for me to be able to see across those stories and how they fit in with the social changes that are happening in our community. So when I read it first, it was without the quilt analogy. And as I say in the foreword, I just binge read them. I thought, right, this is a project, get on, you know. I binge read all the stories at once because that way they stay in an amalgam in my head. The odd time I've written a foreword, that's just what I know my process is. And the themes then that begin to drop out are just so much about love and loss and then betrayal. And that's where one starts. You can't help it, right? Even as an older person thinking about what do my next 10, 15, if I'm lucky, years look like. You just can't help but feel a little betrayal around the stories that we thought we were in about aging in place. And some of these stories really tell quite a contrary tale to that idea.
I found a sense of I can't count on what I thought was there, which everyone is looking for a safe place to live and a safe place to be in their aging years that allows them to have enough finances behind them in order to be somewhere that is safe and comfortable. And then we hear about all these support systems, and our community works very hard to provide support systems for people who are trying to stay in their home or for people who are having to move into other accommodations. But there doesn't seem to be enough.
Yeah, and you know, in the housing work we're doing with the Institute, we're looking at what locally could we be doing to create more affordable housing for people. Never mind what the federal government, the provincial government might, you know, get about doing. What it's us that live here, and what can we actually do? And I often feel that work is it's systems work. What would be the change that we would make in our housing system locally that would make this kind of a difference? But often in that work, it's like there are two silos of people thinking. There are those who are like the Poverty Task Force, the United Way, thinking very hard about the immediate crises that people are in around housing. And this does not exclude elders. You know, if you walk down our streets now, you will notice people who are quite a bit older, who are obviously struggling to age in place and with good services. You just have to stand outside O'Share, for example, to experience that. So there's this emergency kind of feel in some parts of our community and in some of the people thinking about housing. And what we've done is take a different route and look at really what the systems aspects of that are. And you have to stay out of the emergency to be able to do that. And both are super valid. But I think when we talk about aging in place, there's a fold in there, so that those helping services that serve aging folks are in the same sort of bind around housing as young people and, you know, most of the people in our communities right now, particularly if you're engaged in rental, which many older people are.
Well, one of the authors, their story is, do I go, or do I stay, or do I go? And this is a question that my husband and I talk about regularly, because, and then we assess the finances around what we have and where we are, and what we would need to have if we chose a different location to create home, and what that would be. And then, so we have to weigh things very carefully in terms of making those decisions. And some of the decisions that were made in the book turned out to be okay for that family. And in other situations, it was devastating. This person ended up in a worse situation without the services and the loss of dignity. And so how do we, I learned a lot of lessons from this book.
Me too.
I am going to do things differently now that I have read this book, because each of the personal stories brought out something to me that said, I need to do this. I need to look at it this way. Okay, so I'm not really going to get the amount of care that I think I might need in this situation? What are my other options and opportunities? And I love the title, Exploring Options in Gray and Bruce. And that, I think, is really important in terms of the book. But at some point, everyone had to make decisions around, do I stay or do I go? Yeah. And will I have a good ending or a bad ending?
It's a little bit like the Cinderella story, isn't it? The sort of expectation that things will be fine, or that the system will support things being fine if individually we're unable to. And I think as older people, the stories in the book really brought home to me how much that sense may not be so, and particularly may not be so in the next while, 10, 15 years as an outlook forward. Things are not apparently getting much better. They seem to be going in the opposite direction. So it is a kind of a comeuppance. And I think that's for me where the sense of betrayal started to come in, because many of us have worked for, social services or social justice or good government kinds of projects over many, many years. But it's like, wait, now what? Now what?
Well, I think that came out in the book too, when people were surprised. And I want to express my gratitude for everyone who contributed, the 29 people who contributed their stories to this book, because in some cases they were really bearing their soul.
Yeah.
And telling us, this is what it's really like for me. It's not necessarily really like for everyone, but it's really like for me. And my first thought after reading it the first time, I thought, I really want to send this to all those decision makers in Ottawa who think they know what aging is all about, and they don't. Yeah. Because it's the stories that anchor in your mind, not the statistics, not the percentages, not the sort of overview of what they think it is, because they're so much younger than we are. But it's the stories that are going to keep them awake at night, knowing that this person who thought they were doing and making the best decision ended up in such a grave decision.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And that's the value of Joan's work, I think, is it's right here.
Yeah.
It's not, in Toronto or in Ottawa, it's right here. And the quilt analogy, if you can look across those stories for what the patterns are, it seems to me that those are the places where we might make individual decisions that are different than if we hadn't seen the quilt. Or, hopefully people in services and in positions of power can also look across the whole of the quilt of it. I know in my family too, in our household, we thought a lot as a result of reading the book about what our next moves might be. We made some decisions based on other people's experiences who were slightly ahead of us, some of whom we knew and some not so much. But it's often not talked about in a broad enough context that you get the sense of, all right here, what are the options? We had a little bit of foreshadowing of this in that I cared for my mum, who died just shortly after the pandemic ended, and had been in my care for some time and ended up in long-term care, which was appropriate for her health condition and for our capacity. But boy, you get to see the holes in the system then. And I was struck by how many people in the book were taking or planning or hoping to have extraordinary efforts to stay out of that system. So it doesn't feel so much like a safety net now,
No, it doesn't, and I do understand that. I know that with my mom's passing, and it's 20 years ago now, she was at home, and it was a lovely ending. In my dad's experience, he did have at 98 and a half, had to go into long-term care because his needs were more extensive than what we could provide for him, and complicated needs that he just needed that care. And we did the best we could, but it wasn't the same gentle passing on as my mother. And with my one of my relatives being in long-term care now because of her situation, my sons, who lived in London, picked up my son who lives in Mississauga, and drove to Ajax and wanted to ensure that their aunt, my sister, was in good hands, because they had heard, at their young age, had heard that things didn't always go well and needed that assurance that she was being well taken care for. Now, her immediate family would do that too, and that was a good decision at that time. We are now in the situation of both being well and healthy, being in a home outside of Owen Sound. And there's where the travel, the no transportation if things go off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah, and just the time lag if you were to have someone were to have a crisis and need an ambulance or something. Yeah, and yet, you know, when you think about, we do live outside of Owen Sound in a lovely little 3-acre paradise, you know. If you think about that, where would one go? There, in our experience, we looked at housing for seniors. We would sell a home, buy a home, sell a home, rent a home, whichever. And just the finances of that don't work very well. The old story was you sold your big family home, relieving it for a young family to purchase and buy in, right? And then you went into some smaller accommodation with some services. But you know, that is really a bit of a mythology now. If you wanted to live in some of those retirement homes, you would have to be extraordinarily wealthy, more so than what our average income is in our community. So then what? You know, then we have seniors moving into then lower income rentals, which is the tightest piece of our housing market, and competing, if there's such a way to think about it like that, with young families who are just coming into their ability to perhaps one day buy a home. Now, you know, quite distant probably in time frame from when you and I first would have purchased homes. So intergenerationally, there's a bit of a mess here, disconnect. Yeah.
Well, and to me, that's disconcerting. But the other thing too is the more information you have, even though reading the story, I couldn't read them at night. I could only read them during the day because I would be up all night thinking about it. But having this information now is helping us to prepare and to make better decisions going forward. And one of the things that we decided to do was to draw all our sons home for a weekend and start that planning process with them, because some of the stories left their children adrift. And the children didn't, I don't know what you want, I'm not sure what you're going to need, I'm not sure how to navigate the system, I don't have a piece of paper or even a will, or even a will to go by. And so we thought, well, this is a being of sound mind and body. Although I wore my red shoes this morning to emphasize the fact that I'm not ready to age. But to to sit them around the kitchen table, and for us, the dining room table, is to lay everything out for them so that they're not adrift. They're not trying to figure things out on their own, that they have a plan that we've given to them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Not too many of those stories talked about the grand plan, right? And I know in my experience of escorting my mom across that threshold of older years, she's gone now, really realizing that any plans we made with her didn't actually fit the circumstances where the decisions needed to be made. And so the horizon for those plans is actually much shorter than I realized. And where we felt successful was where we had relationship enough to guess what she might have wanted had she been more able to speak it, or to ask her in a way that we felt confident we had a sense of what she actually wanted. I mean, sometimes asking 2 or 3 times the same question to see if you get the same answer is a useful thing. But how it's only really from reading the stories of others that you get the disconnect between what the narrative, the political narrative of what the system, how it's working, and the reality that people are actually living. And one of those stories, I've forgotten just whose it was now, but it was a woman who speaks about her husband's disability through aging, and then moving repeatedly to be able to accommodate his ability in the right kind of structure, so he didn't have to go into the system, whatever that meant at that point. And that's something we took really seriously. We started to think about how many moves would we be willing to make, or would we have to make? And we actually made a decision to start to hire people to help us maintain us where we are. And my partner, being a bit of a math, he said, you know, if you think about how much money we're going to be spending in real estate fees, moving from, you know, spot to spot to spot, why don't we just begin to hire assistants now so nobody gets hurt, and you know, we can cope with the land we live on and the activities that we love to do there. And that's not a strategy that either one of us had really thought about to plan for.
Well, there's so many things that have come out of this book, and so many strategies that we can try to put into place and to plan forward. But the other thing I also learned was you make a plan, and then you have to be flexible enough to make another plan.
Exactly.
And maybe another plan. But I think the foundation there, and the fact that we have this treasure, this book, Aging in Place, to draw from, and to be able to prepare us going forward. And that's why I feel such gratitude for the people who wrote their stories, because they are giving us a bit of a roadmap and some tools. And I found some tools that I'm wanting to utilize. But I think there's still the fear of living alone and that sense of isolation, and that reflects back to some of the political decisions that have been made and that are putting people in those situations who really didn't want to be alone or isolated, because it's, do I pay rent or do I buy food? And that becomes the struggle in their life. And those are those being political or grander, overshadowing maybe some dark clouds, maybe a little sunshine, but some dark clouds that we have to navigate.
You know, Joan did a wonderful thing when she held the book launch for this.
Oh, yes.
I've never sat with so many older people thinking about being old before. And I I felt really happy to be there, but I also felt very happy to be in a small community where we know each other. And I wonder more and more about the agency at the local level, you know, where people can actually provide, and do actually, many of those stories provide for each other some of what the system may disappoint, you know? And I think in a small community like ours, we have the capacity to organize around some of our needs for each other. And it's not something that I see us doing outside of recreation and so on for seniors. But certainly housing is an interesting question when you think about almost all the women that I know for many years here. At some point, there's been a conversation about what if we built our own place to age in place in? What would it look like? And we're pretty good at the design, you know, it's usually a circle. We've got our own spaces, got a communal kitchen, it's got gardens, you know. And actually, in some places, people are doing this.
Isn't this a place called Abbeyfield? That has yes. And I did hear an episode on CBC a few years ago how a group of women got together and bought a house.
Yes.
And then set up those services within the house, and how to care for each other.
Well, then we've been learning through the housing stuff about non-market housing, which essentially is non-profit housing of one sort or another. And there are all kinds of co-ops. Glassworks did a wonderful video program with 3 different co-ops in different places. And they were mostly all older people, many single, some coupled, you know. And those were just homemade solutions to some of the dilemmas we read about in the book. And I don't know, in that group that Joan convened, I just had the feeling that, well, there might be more to this story yet.
Well, I did pick up the quote that aging in place is not for sissies. It's a lot harder than we think, a lot more to it, and we do need to come together as an aging community, because maybe it's the grassroots part of it, being the springboard, aging in place, exploring options in Grey and Bruce, that it's a springboard for some folks to start planning on their own way of building what is actually needed in our community.
And the bigger patchwork, of course, is where are the models of that being done? And there are some. How could we learn about that? Who'd be keen? And particularly for those of us fortunate enough to currently have a place we think we're aging in, you know, there's a little leverage there that might allow some options.
Well, the other thing too is you should never tee off an older person, because they have too much time on their hands to make your life difficult. So thank you, Marilyn. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
And join me next time over coffee.
This program is brought to you by Rogers Xfinity, connecting you to more of what you love. Visit Rogers.com for more details. Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.
Missing your favorite channels? Get them on Rogers Xfinity TV. Now in free preview with Rogers Xfinity TV.
With clubs, leagues, and courts in every province and territory across Canada, squash is the sport for wall-to-wall fun, fitness, and friendship. from coast to coast to coast. Learn to play and you'll want to do it every day. Squash. Play inside the box.